The moment the doctor stepped back into the hallway, my mother exhaled, slowly, like a woman setting down something heavy she'd been carrying a long time. I was supposed to be unconscious. The fentanyl drip was supposed to have taken me under 20 minutes ago. It hadn't. So the trustee designation, my brother said, lowering his voice to something he thought was quiet. If she's incapacitated, that triggers the succession clause. We have to act before she signs anything new, my mother said. She's been talking to that lawyer in Kingston. My brother's voice dropped lower. Simone and I are going to drive up to the cottage this weekend, get the Muskoka property valued before she's back on her feet. If we move the appraisal through Dad's old broker. What about the truck? My mother said. Sell it, my brother said flatly. It's sitting in a shed rotting. She doesn't even drive it. The truck. Dad's truck. I kept my eyes closed. I slowed my breathing. I lay absolutely still in that narrow bed at Kingston General, listening to the two people who shared my blood price out my life like it was an estate sale. I need to go back a little, because none of this started in that hospital room. It started in a garage in Napanee, 22 years ago, with two pairs of hands covered in motor grease and a radio playing the tragically hip from a paint-splattered workbench. My father was a civil engineer by trade and a restorer by obsession. He found the truck in a field outside of Deseronto in the early 90s. A 1972 Ford F-100 custom cab, primer gray, rust eating through the wheel wells like something alive and hungry. Every other person who'd looked at it had turned away. My father paid the farmer $400 and had it towed home on a flatbed. We spent 6 years on that truck. Not continuously, there were stretches of months where it sat covered in a tarp while my father worked 60-hour weeks on a highway expansion project in eastern Ontario. But every weekend he could, and every summer I was home from university, we were back under the hood. He taught me how to rebuild a carburetor, how to read the grain of old steel, how to weld a patch panel without warping the surrounding metal. His hands were enormous and deliberate. He moved through a garage the way some people move through a library, slowly, like everything there deserved a certain kind of attention. The truck wasn't beautiful when we finished it. It was honest, British racing green, which he'd chosen because he said it was the color of serious people. The bench seat had been reupholstered in dark leather by a shop in Kingston he'd been going to for 30 years. When we finally drove it out of the garage on a warm Saturday in September, my mother barely looked up from her magazine. She never understood what that truck was. To her, it was a waste of money, an embarrassing relic, something her husband loved more than he loved her social calendar. She wanted a house in the glebe. She wanted European vacations and a wine fridge and dinners at the Rideau Club. My father gave her a comfortable life in a solid limestone house in Kingston and weekends at a cottage on Clear Lake near Peterborough that he'd built mostly with his own hands, starting with the foundation. When my father died 4 years ago, a massive cardiac event in the driveway, one Tuesday morning in November, the ambulance taking 17 minutes to reach them in the countryside, he left everything in meticulous order. He was that kind of man. The cottage, the investment accounts, the RRSP proceeds, the rental property on Princess Street, all of it flowed into a family trust, and he named me sole trustee. My mother had signed off on the arrangement years earlier, without reading it carefully. My brother had never asked about it, because at the time he was 35 and still convinced his next business venture would be the one that finally worked. That was then. By the time I ended up in Kingston General with a ruptured appendix that a walk-in clinic had spent 3 days misdiagnosing as a muscle strain, my brother had accumulated 2 failed businesses, a line of credit he could not service, and a very focused interest in the trust documents. The surgical team brought me through the appendectomy without complications. But by the time my family arrived, the post-operative medication had me drifting, in and out, the room tilting gently at its edges. The nurse had just left. My mother had arranged herself in the chair nearest the window, her handbag on her lap, her posture exact, and composed the way it always was in public. I heard everything. My brother pacing slowly between the chair and the foot of my bed, my mother's voice low and controlled, the word trust used 4 times in under 2 minutes, and then, "She doesn't even drive it, sell it." I did not move, I did not react, I breathed in a slow medicated rhythm and let them keep talking. My brother and his wife were planning to drive up to the cottage that weekend, get the property valued quietly. He'd already spoken with a real estate broker in Peterborough who handled rural waterfront. 1,200 square feet of 3-season cottage on Clear Lake, currently worth somewhere between $800,000 and $1.2 million, depending on the dock permits. My mother said she was thinking about the rental income from Princess Street. $4,000 a month, she said. That should have been going to family all along. The rental income went into the trust. The trust paid for my mother's supplemental health coverage, her property taxes, her utilities, and a gym membership she used approximately once. I had been quietly supplementing her life for 4 years, and she was discussing it as though I'd been stealing from her. The moment their voices moved into the hallway, I opened my eyes. The room tilted. I breathed through it. I waited for the nausea to pass, and then I reached for the phone on the bedside table with the care of someone diffusing something. I scrolled to the contact I needed. Raymond had managed my father's properties for 23 years. He was 64 years old, semi-retired, the kind of man who communicated almost entirely in short sentences and showed up without being asked when something needed doing. He had driven 3 hours through a January ice storm to deal with a burst pipe at the cottage the winter after my father died. He had stood at the graveside with his cap in his hands, not crying, but something in him visibly changed. He answered on the second ring. "It's me," I said. My voice came out rougher than I expected. A pause. "You're supposed to be in surgery." I'm out. I need your help." Another pause, longer. In 23 years I had never called Raymond from a hospital bed. He understood what that meant. "Tell me what you need," he said. I told him quickly, in the flat practical language we both understood, that my brother was planning to drive to Clear Lake this weekend, that I needed him there first, that I needed someone to photograph the property and contact my lawyer in Kingston. "Your lawyer," Raymond said. "Anita?" "Yes." "I've got her number." A pause. "I was at the cottage last week, put the doc in for the season." "Your brother called me," he said, 2 days ago, asked how the place was looking, said you'd mentioned maybe listing it. The dull ache in my abdomen sharpened into something colder. I had never said that, not once, not to anyone. "Raymond?" I said. "Yeah." "I'm going to be in this hospital for at least 4 more days. I need you to be my eyes." A long silence followed, not uncomfortable, the kind Raymond had always been at ease in, the kind my father had understood about him. "Your dad asked me something," he said finally. "When he was sick that first time, the spring before he died, when the doctors thought it might be something in his lungs. He said, 'Raymond, if anything ever happens to me, look after Willa.' I told him that was a fool thing to ask because I was going to do it regardless." A pause. "So no, we're not talking about compensation right now. We're talking about what needs to happen." He hung up before I could respond. The next 4 days were the longest of my life. I was kept for observation, a minor complication with the anesthesia, blood pressure to monitor. I let my mother believe I was more incapacitated than I was. I let her arrange the pillows and bring me terrible vending machine tea and conduct murmured phone conversations in the hallway. She thought I couldn't hear through the wall. She had called her own financial advisor, not the trust's, hers. She had also, apparently, left a voicemail for an estate litigation lawyer in Ottawa. I lay in that hospital bed at night and did quiet exercises under the covers to keep from going completely to pieces. I monitored my pain levels the way you monitor a load-bearing structure. Pragmatically, without sentiment, adjusting for tolerance where possible. During the day, I submitted to vitals checks and answered my mother's careful questions with one-word answers. Meanwhile, Raymond drove to Clear Lake. He photographed every room of the cottage. He found, in the filing cabinet in the back bedroom where my father had always kept property documents, a folder labeled Trust. Supplemental with a sticky note in my father's handwriting. "Raymond knows where this is." Inside, a second notarized letter from my father's original solicitor, reaffirming the trust structure and explicitly addressing the scenario where a trustee becomes temporarily incapacitated due to illness. The letter named a successor trustee, Anita Fournier, my father's Kingston lawyer, who had been quietly holding that designation for 4 years. My father had planned for this. Of course he had. He was an engineer, he accounted for failure modes. Raymond drove the folder directly to Anita's office. He did not call ahead. He walked in, set the folder on her desk, and said, "Willa's in Kingston General. Her brother is going to the cottage this weekend. What do we do?" Anita called me at 8 the next morning. Her voice was the voice of a woman who had spent 30 years in Ontario courts and developed a complete immunity to panic. "I need you to confirm your mental competency," she said, "in writing and on video before you're discharged." "I'm entirely competent," I said. "I know that," she said, "but we're going to document it anyway, because your brother's lawyer, and yes, he has already retained one, is going to argue otherwise. Here's what we're going to do." She walked me through it methodically. The trust documents were secure. The successor trustee designation was valid. My brother could apply to the Ontario Superior Court of Justice for a competency review, but the burden of proof was his, and the bar was high. The supplemental letter my father had left was not a guarantee, but it was a record of intent, and intent mattered. If you call your brother today and tell him what you know, Anita said, he will pivot, he'll regroup, he'll find another angle, and he will keep finding angles until you either settle or litigate for a decade. These people do not stop. I stared at the ceiling. So don't tell him, I said. Don't tell him, she confirmed. Before you take that the wrong way, I want to be clear about something. I am not a vindictive person, or I didn't used to think of myself that way. I had spent 4 years managing a trust I was never legally required to be so generous with. I paid my mother's supplemental health coverage. I drove 4 hours in the middle of March to deal with a flooding issue in the Princess Street rental so she wouldn't lose the income that month. I had covered my brother's heating costs through 18 months of his second business failing because I did not want him going cold through a Kingston winter. What I'd been doing was trying to buy something that had never been for sale. My mother did not love me the way I had needed her to. She had always preferred my brother in the specific way that some parents prefer the child who stays close, who requires constant management, who makes them feel necessary. I was the one who left at 18 and built something. She experienced that as abandonment, even when I came back for every holiday, even when I took on the trust management, even when I gave and gave and gave. My brother did not want my help. He wanted my father's money without my father's conditions attached. On my 4th day in hospital, my brother came alone to visit. He brought coffee from the Tim's in the lobby, which he knew I liked. He sat in the chair by the window and told me he was worried about me. He said this with genuine warmth. My brother has always been charming in a way I used to admire and had since learned to watch carefully. He asked about the surgery, about the pain, about when I'd be released, and then gently, like someone suggesting a minor administrative change. I was thinking, while you're recovering, it might make sense to give me a temporary signing authority on the trust accounts. Just so bills can get paid, maintenance things at the cottage, nothing big. I looked at my coffee cup. That's thoughtful, I said. Let me think about it. He left satisfied. He thought I was too tired to reason clearly. He thought he had the weekend. He did not have the weekend. Anita filed the competency documentation with the court clerk on Friday morning. She simultaneously issued a formal letter to my brother's lawyer, advising that any approach to the trust accounts, the Princess Street property, or the Clear Lake Cottage would be treated as a breach of the Ontario Trustee Act and referred accordingly. She included a certified copy of the trust instrument and the supplemental letter, with my father's notarized signature on every page. My brother's lawyer went quiet. On Saturday, I was discharged. Raymond drove me home in his own truck. A newer one, nothing like my father's, but he'd put a blanket on the seat because he knew I'd be cold from the hospital air. He didn't talk for most of the drive, and I didn't need him to. I spent the next 2 weeks recovering at home and letting my mother believe I was more fragile than I was. She came twice, both times with casseroles, both times spending most of the visit on her phone in the kitchen. I did not tell her about Anita's filings. I did not tell her about the supplemental letter. I let her plan. What she was planning, I learned from Anita, was a formal application to the Ontario courts to have me declared temporarily incapable of managing the trust. My brother's lawyer had filed the paperwork. My mother had provided an affidavit. She had enlisted 2 of her friends, women I had known since childhood, who had eaten Christmas dinners at our family's table, to testify that I had seemed erratic and confused in the months before my hospitalization. The hearing was set for a Tuesday morning in November. I walked in wearing a charcoal gray suit my father had once said made me look like I meant business. I sat at the respondent's table next to Anita. My brother sat across the room with his lawyer. My mother sat in the gallery, her hands folded, her expression arranged carefully into something resembling concern. Anita presented the competency evaluation completed at Kingston General 4 days after my surgery, cognitive function, executive reasoning, memory, all administered by a neuropsychologist and documented with clinical precision. She presented my CPA license renewal from 3 months prior. She presented 2 years of trust account records showing consistent, legally sound management. My brother's lawyer tried. He suggested my post-surgical medication had impaired my judgment during my hospitalization. He noted that I had made no major financial decisions in the weeks since my discharge and characterized this as evidence of diminished capacity. Anita pointed out that the only major financial decision I had declined to make was granting my brother signing authority over accounts he had no legal standing to access. The application was dismissed. The judge used the phrase "without merit" twice. I looked at my mother when the decision came down. She was staring at the table. My brother was already speaking quietly to his lawyer. Neither of them looked at me. I stood, gathered my documents, and walked out of that courthouse into a gray November morning in Kingston that was cold and sharp, and felt, to me, like the first real breath I'd taken in 6 weeks. Raymond was waiting at the bottom of the steps. He had parked across the street and walked over, and he was standing there in his canvas jacket with his hands in his pockets, looking exactly as he always looked, unhurried, solid, present. "Well?" he said. "It's done," I said. He nodded once, the same way he'd always nodded when my father reported that something was repaired properly and would hold. We went for coffee at a diner on Division Street my father had liked, the kind of place with laminate menus and white ceramic mugs refilled without asking. Raymond had pie. I had eggs, which I hadn't been able to eat properly in weeks, and they tasted like the best thing I'd ever had. Over the following month, I made the decisions I'd been quietly preparing. The trust was restructured with Anita's guidance. My mother's essential expenses continued. My father would have wanted that, and I was not my mother. The discretionary amounts that had been going toward the golf club membership and my brother's short-term loans were redirected. The trust now funded a bursary for engineering students at Queen's University, administered through the faculty named after my father. It wasn't a grand gesture, it was the right one. My father's truck, the 1972 F-100, sitting under a tarp in the shed at Clear Lake, the shed Raymond had maintained for 2 decades, I arranged to be transported to a restoration shop in Belleville run by a man my father had known for 30 years. I asked him to finish the small things my father hadn't gotten around to: the passenger side door seal, the headliner, the floor mat. When it was done, I donated it to the Napanee Agricultural Fair's Heritage Vehicle Program. My father had gone to that fair every September for as long as I could remember. The truck belonged somewhere he had loved, tended by people who understood what it meant to build something with their hands. It was not the ending I'd originally imagined for it. It was the one I chose, and I think he would have understood. As for Raymond, I called him into my home office on a Thursday afternoon in early December, the radiator clanking, snow starting outside the window. I slid a document across the desk, a formal arrangement through the trust for a property management retainer, structured to provide him and his wife with indexed income for the rest of his life, with a housing benefit attached to the Clear Lake property he had been maintaining for more than 2 decades. He looked at the document for a long time. "You don't owe me this," he said. "I know," I said. "My father would have done it eventually. I'm just doing it now." He pressed his thumb against the corner of the paper and was quiet for a moment. He looked out the window at the snow, then he looked back at me. "He'd be proud of you," he said. "You know that." I don't know what I said back. I remember the snow and the radiator and the sound of Raymond folding the document along its crease with the care of a man who knows that certain things deserve to be handled gently. My brother stopped contacting me in January. My mother calls occasionally. Short calls, careful, calibrated, neither warm nor hostile. I answer. I am civil. There are limits now on what I give, and those limits are mine to draw, and I have stopped apologizing for them. The cottage is still there. Raymond put the dock in again last spring. I drove up in late May alone and sat on that dock for most of an afternoon with a thermos of coffee, watching a loon work its way across the far end of the bay. My father built that dock with his own hands. There are things worth holding on to and things you have to release to keep holding the right ones. I'm still learning where each line falls, but I'm drawing those lines myself now, which is the only way any of it means anything at all.